Thank you for joining us for this session on evidence ecosystems. My name is Geoff Mulgan from UCL and IPO, and I will try to be sort of air traffic control and also share a few words to introduce the session. This is one of a series we've been doing on innovations in evidence methods, looking at all sorts of things from generative AI to systems maps to transferability to lived experience. The session will be recorded. Do please use the chat function in a lively way. It has been in the last ones. Put in questions or comments or even more usefully links to things which you are relevant, which others should be aware of, and we will share all of that after the session. We have four fantastic speakers joining us, all of whom have a lot of knowledge about how evidence ecosystems work. We'll hear from them in turn. Tanja Kuchenmüller from World Health Organization, Will Moy from Campbell Collaboration, Eleanor Williams from the Australian Centre for Evaluation in the government there, and Jonathan Brecken. But I will kick off with just a few minutes on the paper which we circulated in advance. It's a sort of slightly long paper. It's one of those ones in the tradition of Mark Twain. I didn't have enough time to write a shorter paper, but tries to reflect on some of the patterns. I mentioned the famous John Maynard Keynes quote that there's nothing governments hate more than to be well informed, because it makes arriving at decisions much more complicated and difficult, and that is definitely sometimes the case. But in fact, quite often governments do like to be well informed. They quite like evidence. In principle, at least, it makes it more likely they will achieve their goals, their promises. It may mean there's less waste of money. It may mean more approbation from the public and from the experts. And at the very least, we can see all over the world governments being pulled in sort of opposite directions, sometimes towards more use of evidence, data, facts. On the other hand, perhaps more instinct, intuition, stories. And it's worth recalling the Trump presidency, the last Trump presidency, coincided with the US passing its Evidence-Based Policy Act. So that was one example of these two counter pulls coinciding. Here we're very much focused on what could be done to reinforce the first direction of more use of evidence, data, facts of all kinds. The word ecosystem is used loosely. An ecosystem can be many things, including a system where lots of things eat each other. That's not what we're talking about here. But we're trying to emphasize this isn't just a linear flow from research into government policy and action. It's much more complicated than that. In the paper, I suggest, as it were, the idealized picture, which probably many of us have, of what sane evidence-based government might look like, with lots of research being done, including randomized controlled trials, experiments, lots of synthesis, living maps of evidence, lots of civil servants and politicians hungry to know the latest findings. And to some extent, the story in the UK in the last generation or so has been a lot of attempts to get us closer to that picture, with many research centres, what works centres, things like the Evaluation Task Force within government, many more organisations doing formal experiments, the Behavioural Insights Team, Innovation Growth Lab, EEF, helped by the media sometimes, BBC programmes like More or Less, organisations like Full Fact, which Will Moy used to run, and many others. And other countries are quite envious of the UK. We seem to have a fairly rich ecosystem with fairly strong support from across the political spectrum. But if you look closer, and this is what I try and do in the paper, things aren't quite as rosy. As I point out, the strongest what work centres are much more focused on professional practice in fields like medicine and teaching rather than policy. In fact, they've been quite careful to avoid too much commentary on policy. Some parts of this system are very embedded in decision-making. NICE is the obvious example in healthcare, though even its decisions take quite a long time to really filter through. but that's very much the exception. In most policy fields, engagement with evidence is a bit of an optional extra. We have some fantastic projects around data, like LEO, which links school data to tax records. But overall, we don't really have a coherent data infrastructure, which some other countries do. New Zealand is a striking example. The unit of analysis of much of this evidence ecosystem is individual interventions. That means often they don't say very much about how things are done, rather what is done. And the systems are not so good, perhaps, for thinking about systems or complex combinations of actions which lead to larger effects. And the relationship with politics is still pretty tricky. It'd be hard to claim there had been a big shift to more evidence-based policies overall in the British system over the last 10 or 20 years. So I then in the paper try and set out what a more mature and plausible infrastructure ecosystem could look like, how it can build up strength around key topics, as we already have to some extent, around things like education, but perhaps have less so in relation to topics such as housing or energy. There's a strong argument for having some capabilities very much rooted in place in the developed nations, but also in the big cities. There's a crucial capability of all the intermediaries in this ecosystem that they understand the different kind of logics, which I described, the logics of politics, of bureaucracy, of science, of the professions, which all point in rather different ways. And we need an ecosystem which is constantly improving and reflecting on its own methods, like the use of systems maps. And in many of the things we'll be talking about today, there's obviously a big argument for international collaboration. Many of the challenges facing different countries are pretty similar to each other. The WHO obviously is an example of that, OECD and a few others, but it's proven much harder than many expected to construct coalitions of multiple countries all trying to orchestrate evidence on the same topic. And finally, I point to perhaps the obvious finding of these systems, that the currency of politics and policy at one level is all about stories in vignettes and killer statistics, and sometimes the way evidence is provided or written about or orchestrated doesn't quite connect with the way in which politics works and the real life of governments. There are many other elements, including in the paper, some discussion of what a coalition for perhaps the next 10 years might look like, how government itself could get its act together, perhaps with a chief social scientist. We have very strong chief scientists in the natural sciences, but still remarkable gaps around social science. And still a challenge of really clarifying, triaging the most pressing evidence needs and ensuring that constant interplay between supply and demand. And a wise evidence ecosystem should be quite self-critical and self-aware, and I hope this session will be part of that process of people who've been very much part of it, living with it, reflecting on both the strengths but also the weaknesses, and crucially pointing us to what might be an agenda for the next 5 or 10 years, which hopefully could have fairly wide buy-in. So I hope that's what you're expecting to hear about in the next 50 or so minutes. And our first speaker will be Tanja Kuchenmüller from the WHO. So Tanja, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jeff, for the introduction and also for the opportunity to contribute to this IPO webinar. It's a delight to be here with you and colleagues and to be speaking today briefly about the WHO Evidence-Informed Policy Network, which is WHO's key initiative when it comes to the interface between evidence and policy, and very much looking at strengthening country systems for interlinking evidence and decision-making. So just a few words on EVIPNet, the Evidence-Informed Policy Network as such, in terms of the mandate. The network is all about promoting the systematic and transparent use of evidence in decision-making to improve health systems, and this through a network structure. I will speak about the network structure on my next slide a little more. Here for me also to emphasize that EVIPNet is demand-driven. So the network is not looking at pushing evidence into the policy-making sphere, but it's the opposite way, that countries are looking at their policy priorities for which then the best available evidence and different forms of evidence depending on the policy questions is being mobilized. It's about capacity building and increasing country leadership. So again, it's not WHO taking the steering wheel, but it's about countries doing the planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of different knowledge translation and evidence to policy exercises and activities. And then beyond individual capacity building, it's about institutionalizing, so the strengthening or establishing of evidence advisory bodies, which we call knowledge translation platforms. And the network is in particular active in 4 of the 6 WHO regions in more than 50 countries. So that just as a quick overview of the mandate of EVIPNet. Then when it comes to the institutional framework that you see on this slide here, we are operating at the 3 different levels. So at the core of the network is the country team, that's the node of the network, which then drives the evidence-informed country-level agenda. And that's the teams, the knowledge translation platforms that we're working with. They're being supported by the regional offices of WHO, and they are very much responsible to provide different kinds of capacity building and training that is tailored to the regional context, but also then creating a learning platform and allowing for exchange of experiences and lessons learned of the different countries and the knowledge translation platforms, the organizational intermediaries. And at headquarters, the unit that I'm leading in the science division, so the unit is called Evidence to Policy and Impact, is coordinating very much the global activities, but also looking at developing new norms and standards, creating partnerships and also fundraising. While this network at the moment is still fairly centralized in nature, what we would like to see over time is that it decentralizes so that the country teams and the knowledge translation platforms actually are leading the process in the longer term without WHO support. So this is the ideal state that we are aiming for. Now, speaking about lessons learned when it comes to the evidence ecosystem, in 2021, during the pandemic, we had a first global WHO Evidence to Policy Summit, which served very much looking at the lessons learned of COVID-19 in relation to the evidence to policy global and country level ecosystem. And EVIPNet, through various mechanisms, participatory mechanisms, a survey that we undertook, but then also as I said, the lessons learned of COVID, looking at previous WHO strategies and resolutions on the evidence to policy nexus. We then came up with this, or the network came up with this call for action, including 4 key strategic domains. That's about the institutionalization of structures and support mechanisms at country level, but also at global level for evidence-informed decision-making, allowing for high-quality norms and standards and tools so that the evidence to policy process and activities are consistent and of high quality. The capacity building, again, and last but not least, providing access to global evidence goods through repositories and making also sure that they're timely and relevant. This call for action was complemented at the time by 2 other policy recommendation sets that were published on the one hand by Cochrane Convenes and also the Evidence Commission. And here for us, really important, and one of the lessons that we need to speak jointly. So if we want to have an impact on the global evidence ecosystem, then while all 3 sets of recommendations are slightly different, we are all aiming for the same and they complement each other. And so we are setting ourselves up jointly to positively influence the landscape when it comes to the nexus between evidence to policy. Institutionalization, again, is very important for the work of the network. And initially, how we started off is that we thought it's essential for countries when they want to strengthen their evidence ecosystem that they need to undertake a situation analysis. So this document that you see here is already quite a few years old. And the thinking at the time was that we need to understand where country level the institutional niche is for countries to strengthen their evidence advisory system. And of course, as you can see here on the slide as well, there is no one blueprint approach. Depending on the country context, different constellation make most sense. In a lot of cases, it's in fact a network structure that then through the different actors and through the different relationships can support evidence utilization and the knowledge brokering process. What we then learned, though, throughout time, and also because we did a process evaluation of EVIPNet, is that despite an increased understanding of the evidence ecosystem, there was still no institutionalization happening. And the question then also was, what is institutionalization? I mean, it's a buzzword, but a lot of people, including WHO, we didn't quite know how to guide member states in this field. And so what we then did as a next step is we undertook a critical interpretive synthesis to develop two frameworks, a domains and a process framework for institutionalizing evidence-informed decision-making. You see on the right-hand side the domains framework, which has 6 different domains, and that goes far beyond just the setting up of structures. So structures would be part of the governance, but many other pillars are essential if we're thinking about institutionalizing evidence-informed decision-making. I won't go into detail, I won't have the time for that, but we developed and published last year then a checklist for member states to use if they're interested to understand where they are in terms of maturity in institutionalization, evidence-informed decision-making, and how to then develop a journey, a roadmap moving forward on the institutionalization agenda. And this checklist we are just piloting in a few selected countries in the Americas, in the WHO European region, and also in Southeast Asia, together with EPI, to validate the checklist, but also to better understand what kind of those pillars that you see on the slide might be, depending on the context, more relevant for the country to promote and strengthen institutionalization. The checklist was also used by various research institutions. So here you see very interesting, in the case of Brazil, during the previous government times, the area of health, where the institutionalization agenda was more advanced, despite the dismantling that happened during the former government, there was a certain resilience. And you see on the left-hand side, the different domains where resilience existed. And this is why CONITEC, the HTA in Brazil, continues to operate, while in the area of environment, the SQE, which was less mature, dismantling had very much more severe consequences in view of the continued operationalization of the evidence-informed policy-making process. EPI has also, so in this case, a PhD student, Veronica Calderon, has also applied the checklist to understand more the context and contextual factors that impact on institutionalization and the various domains. So a very interesting piece, again, that allows us to better understand what factors are important and play a big role in this anti-institutionalization process. Just one last word for institutionalization. Of course, one cannot commence institutionalization if there's not a basic understanding and awareness for evidence-informed decision-making. If that's not given, then of course we don't even have to start off with the institutional agenda. Just as a caveat to mention from my side. But then, apart from institutionalization, I think lesson learned again when we think about the local evidence ecosystem and about knowledge brokering is that we really have to walk the talk. We need to also be evidence-informed when it comes to our own interventions and activities. This is why then with PACE, with the Pan-African Center for Evidence, we have been developing an evidence map on the science and arts of using evidence. We will be publishing that, I guess, in a month's time. And building on the gaps that were identified in this evidence gap map and other review work, we are at the moment developing with partners and a very participatory process, multi-sectoral research agenda for the research on research use, so that indeed then hopefully in the near future we'll be able to, as I said, better walk the talk and underfeed our own interventions with reliable evidence. In the same context, also, we believe it's really important for the evidence ecosystem and for organizational knowledge brokers and others to have solid theories of change. And that also means that the theories of change are, in fact, informed by research evidence. And this is another tool I wanted to highlight that we will be publishing soon. So allowing the theory of change process being more embedded in research evidence. And with that, I'm going to hand over back to you, Geoff.
Thank you very much, Tanya. And in the chat are a few links to some excellent pieces Tanya and colleagues have written, and that further material is there to come. I mean, the health in some ways is the model other fields want to copy, though it's worth remembering that it's only about 50 years since evidence-based medicine became a widespread idea and actually was resisted by many in the health field back in the 70s and 80s. So it's relatively recent, perhaps in historical terms, that health has been so attuned to evidence. Our second speaker is Will Moy, also now from a global perspective, and I've been carry on encouraging you to put links or comments or questions in the chat as our speakers speak. Will, over to you.
Thank you, Geoff. A really personal introduction, the attempt to build out from health. I should say I come from a global perspective. I run the Campbell Collaboration, though really it's run by about 1,000 volunteers around the world, not by me. But most of my work has been promoting the accurate and honest use of evidence in UK public policy for the last decade and a half. So I'm very much learning the global perspective and here to learn as well as to share my thoughts. As many of you will know, evidence synthesis, systematic reviews, evidence mapping, and so on have transformed medicine. They've saved lives and billions of pounds, probably dollars. It's wildly underused in the rest of public policy. And so we often end up with decision-making based on no evidence or late-night Google searches or panicked phone calls to experts to get on the telly more than other experts or single bits of research that don't reproduce and so on. The Campbell Collaboration has set out to change that. By introducing a program of systematic reviewing across social science and supporting the sector of people doing high quality evidence synthesis to grow that work in lots of different institutions. Campbell's been going for 25 years. It has a stellar reputation for doing high quality synthesis, but it needs to do that at a larger scale, increase the take up of it, and across the whole field of public policy. So we're setting out to make evidence synthesis faster, cheaper, and more useful, with technology being a key enabler of that, making evidence more reusable, more ability to tailor it to different contexts, to ask for difficult questions about the generalizability of findings, and also to make the synthesis process much more efficient. And one of the interesting things about evidence synthesis, I think, in public policy and the social sciences is how different it is from evidence synthesis in medicine, where it's such a proven technique. And I think there is a real risk of trying to generalize from the health area to the rest of public policy and the much more politically contested environment that most of public policy goes into, the much more adversarial information environment that most of public policy operates in. And I think there was some signs of that risk in the previous presentation as WHO perhaps eliding slightly the world of health policy and the world of policy in general in a way that I think doesn't actually stand out to the day-to-day experience of how policy is made. One of the big exciting recommendations of the Global Evidence Commission, which Tanya recommended, was that one of the things we can do that is easiest, cheapest, and most in front of us thing to strengthen evidence ecosystems worldwide is create a suite of 100 living evidence syntheses, summing up in a real-time, constantly up-to-date form the state of the art of human knowledge about how to deliver important public policy goals. I think one of the that's deliverable now. It's achievable now. It's a really important, frankly, easy win that's available to us. And it's really interesting if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which are in need of a rescue plan, as the Secretary General has put it, how little evidence was used in defining those goals and how little evidence we have on how they can be successfully achieved and now turned around. It's a good example of why a suite of evidence synthesis can be so valuable and why I moved from the front line of trying to contest in public debate day to day, hour to hour, how good quality evidence can be used upstream to the Campbell Collaboration, where we're trying to change the water that the fish swim in to provide good evidence that becomes the starting point for those conversations. But 3 quick reflections on Geoff's wider paper before I hand over. The first is that we talk about an evidence ecosystem, and I think there's some truth in the people eating other bits of the ecosystem, and much more truth in people swimming around in the same pond without really noticing each other. It's striking to me how often different parts of the evidence ecosystem have a tendency perhaps to see themselves as all of the evidence ecosystem, whether you're looking at science advisors or economists or statisticians. How much do we say what is our common offer to people trying to make decisions, and how do we stitch that together in an attractive way rather than leaving them to pick between the bits that are easiest to use or most attractive. I think there's a lot more room for collaboration. I'm excited by some of the work that's currently going on to build collaboration between synthesis and evaluation professionals, for example. And I think we could do a lot more of that across the whole evidence ecosystem to become easier to use and easier to work with. So being an ecosystem that is deliberately an ecosystem, I think, is an opportunity for us. Two of Geoff's points are relationships and stories. And I think they both point to a deeper thing, that evidence people, by and large, have not invested well in strategic communications. Relationships and stories are both part of an underlying need to have a good communications capability. Any organization that depends to achieve its goals on the actions, behaviors, beliefs, knowledge of other people depends on communications to achieve its goals. I think as you end up with evidence organizations, usually led by evidence people, the question is, when are they acquiring the skills to manage communications at an organizational level and use that to achieve strategic goals? How are we supporting them to do that? Do we think the sector is effective at doing that? As somebody who's very much been on the communications side of it all my career, I think that is a big open opportunity to use communications more effectively. And related to that, my third point is that there is a striking lack in the UK, at least, of a serious political coalition in support of evidence in public life. We have, as Geoff said, and I think it's an inspiring thing, a really strong set of institutions that in all my international conversations in my previous job and this one are envied in a lot of places. And when I think about some of my old fact-checking colleagues in countries where challenging the quality of evidence in public life was a life-risking thing to do, we should recognize just how lucky we are. But what we don't have is the advocates or the relationships to really make the case for the value of evidence or the value for money we get from evidence. It's striking that in a time when government spending is trying to be reduced, cutting evidence is seen as a cheap thing to cut rather than as a false economy. And I'm not sure that stands up to scrutiny. And one of the parts of a serious political coalition for evidence would be a clear, probably simple, one thing, possibly three things, ask from the evidence community as a whole to public policymakers, the Treasury, the Prime Minister's Office, the Cabinet, for what would make evidence stronger. I think we're a long way from having a concerted set of voices behind one ask. I do think it's an achievable goal, and I think it's an interesting challenge to explore. So there are some thoughts, some provocations. Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much, Will. And I hope before the end of this session, we might pursue some of those last points. I should say I encourage all our speakers to disagree with each other, because that's actually how we get to better insight and evidence, is often through argument. Eleanor, I'm not sure if you're going to, violently object to what Tanya and Will said, but if you want to, please do so. Anyway, Eleanor Williams, over to you.
It's very tempting. Thank you. Thank you so much, Geoff. And I do have maybe one or two little points to raise, but mostly I'm in fierce agreement with you both. And look, I'm just really delighted to be here. I'm in the UK at the moment, just for a few weeks. And usually my day job is as the Managing Director of the Australian Centre for Evaluation, where we are very much focused on getting more evidence directly fed into policy, and we sit in the Commonwealth Department of Treasury, and so we're very interested in how you use evidence to drive evidence-based investment as well. But I have worked on both sides of the ledger, so both as an evidence producer in research and evaluation roles, but also as a policy maker. So the question of what makes evidence ecosystems work has been really of interest to me throughout my career. And today I just wanted to focus on a small number of findings just from some of my current research, which is looking at evidence use in fast-paced policy-making environments. So really thinking about the individual roles and entities involved in evidence generation and use. And I particularly had a few reflections today just about the role of supply and demand for evidence within the ecosystem, a little bit about the complexity of the relationships and the steps which have been sort of given a nod to. And I probably would challenge Will here a little bit that there are any easy wins for evidence to be had, but also some particular thoughts about how the ecosystem is impacted by time pressure, because I think that's a genuine reality for most modern policy making. And that's driven by a range of factors. So not only kind of the rolling crises that a lot of countries are experiencing at the moment, but also public expectations and the media and electoral cycle all lead to this sort of continual time pressure that we all need to factor in. So just starting with this, this diagram, I think it's really important to sort of always keep in front of mind that productive evidence use is both a matter of supply and demand, and we often focus on the supply side about, well, how do we generate more policy relevant evidence? But we obviously know that we need to drive the demand for that as well on the other side of the book as well. And one thing that particularly came out of my current research is probably that this diagram sort of obfuscates some of the complexity of the ecosystem, which I think is important to recognise if we are going to build the full suite of skills and roles required to achieve evidence-informed policy. And the bottom part of the diagram is really how the literature around evidence-based policy is formulated. It has this idea that there's some people who generate evidence, like the researchers and the data analysts and the evaluators. And there's some people who play the role of knowledge brokers in the middle. They meet the demand of decision makers on the right. But my current work, particularly looking at evidence use during COVID-19, just draws out there's much more messiness in the reality of the situation, including quite a lot of people who straddle the roles. So just moving to the next slide, what I wanted to illustrate here is really that there's multiple steps in the supply side of the evidence ecosystem. And it's really only in a small number of cases that it's one person or a small group of people that undertake all these steps. It's really the culmination of a lot of people and entities who played this role. So using an example from COVID, if you think about this situation where you've got this huge amount of evidence being generated in very short timeframes internationally, and that's being sort of gathered by each step in this chain is increasingly closer to the decision making. So you've got people gathering the evidence at the local level. So there's people who are informing decisions on vaccines or masks. It's being synthesized for the purpose of decision making. And at this point, a lot of different evidence sources are being combined, including things like community sentiment and stakeholder perspectives. Then you're translating into standard formats, communicating. Will did a good job of explaining the importance of good communication, and then it's being used to set policy direction. So the thing I just really want to draw out is it's really not one big kind of blob of a step. It's a lot of different steps in the chain to get there. And obviously the dynamic is not linear. This is just a way of breaking it down. But I also want to emphasize there's multiple steps on the demand side as well. So again, it's not as simple as a decision maker kind of making a request. And say another example from COVID would be, a decision maker wants to take action on COVID transmission in abattoirs, which was an emergency issue in lots of different countries. So then down the line, there's somebody who's assembling kind of a range of requests at that point to say, well, let's look at current transmission rates, published literature around managing communicable diseases in those refrigerated settings. They seek input from employers and peak bodies. And then you're really sort of refining the request, working to digest it. And I guess the one thing that these diagrams can't pick up is that dynamic that we've been talking about, the real dance between the supply and demand side that happens at that point, with the back and forth trying to understand the question that's at hand. And that's the real dance that's required to get to productive use. Now, I did just briefly want to zero in on the question of time pressure, which, as I said, I think is just a reality of the situation most policymakers work in. But it's well recognised that the evidence producers tend to work on different timeframes than those kind of using the evidence. And I just want to highlight just some particular findings that brings out. So there's pros and cons to the time pressure. So one, the stress and limited cognition. The upside of that is in those times of policy pressure, you do get intense focus on the evidence. So it is a real window of opportunity for evidence producers to get that interaction with decision makers. But we also know that it really introduces this risk of both individual and group biases that happen. We know about the anchoring effect. So early evidence that's received is given sort of undue priority. Once it gets into group decision making, you often have a bit of recency bias, that the most kind of salient and absorbable bit of information, like the killer statistic, will suddenly get real momentum. And we did see that a lot in COVID-19. I think a lot of people remember that early evidence around this, and before we realised that COVID was airborne, because the early evidence suggested it was surface driven, led to this real focus on surface cleaning and hand washing rather than masks, because of that kind of the power of that early evidence that was absorbed very quickly and with that laser focus at that time. And so, conscious of time, I just had 3 very quick takeaways that I wanted to highlight today. So one is just, given that huge chain involved in the evidence ecosystem, I think it's really important that we all kind of reflect on where we sit and who sits to either side of us in that supply and demand relationship and how we relate to others. And then that logically leads to that, the value of partnering with other players. So there's plenty of kind of research out there which shows that one of the key enablers to determining whether evidence reaches policy is the quality of the relationships between the people who generate evidence and the trust they have with the decision makers on the other side. And then thirdly, I just wanted to emphasise that we all need to kind of factor in that time pressure in policy making. So we know that we're all working at different speeds, but it really falls on all of us to think about how we manage that dynamic and respond to that question of time pressure as well. With that, I'll hand back to Geoff.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. Yeah, and thinking fast and slow in relation to ecosystems, as we might return to. So our last speaker is Jonathan Brecken, and after all our speakers have spoken, do please, as they put questions in the chat, I'll maybe try and focus in on one or two of these broad strategic questions, but also what might be priorities and ask a platform, as it were, for a coalition for the next stages. But Jonathan, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Geoff. I'm not going to disagree, but I'm going to be a bit grumpy, if that's all right. It's partly because over the last 3 years, I've worked around the evidence ecosystem in the margins of things, briefly in Parliament, briefly in the Department for Education, universities, knowledge brokering bodies, professional bodies, and of course, universities. And I think there's been 3 things I've really seen missing, which I want to focus in on now in my 7 minutes. But the first thing is that I think there's a real need for maps that actually are useful maps that dig into some of the players in our ecosystem. And the one you got here is on scientific advice. There was a great one a couple of weeks ago from the Government Office for Science, just on arm's length bodies, quangos, and their scientific committees. But it's an absolutely great, rich resource. All these bodies I've never heard of. The Department for Work and Pensions got a committee on methods. If anyone knows about that, please tell me. I'm trying to find out more about those. Because I'm actually writing a report about the evidence ecosystem generally. But I do think we need to have these sort of practical, useful maps about the world as it is, though, not an idealized model. I had a go trying to do this a few years ago, as Geoff said, when I ran the Alliance for Useful Evidence at Nesta, and it was an incredibly painful process trying to get all the bodies just in the UK and just as social policy. We gave up on health because there are just too many in health. Didn't even get to some of the pure economics bodies, but it took forever to do, and lots of people are pissed off with it, all sorts of things. Even the design, you could click through and get through to resources, but people say, why are you missing? But I still think there's a value for that, particularly because most of the great maps I've seen in the UK context tend to have a science focus. And Audrey, you're quite right. It's great to have a mix of subjects, but I think there's a real value in seeing the space in the social science and evaluation and social policy. So maps are useful. I also think my second point is we really can learn from many other disciplines, countries, subjects, ways of doing things. I looked at just this kind of category of intermediaries for an organization called Transforming Evidence, another part of the ecosystem. And even just the names for what we call these bloody things was a nightmare. I actually became a real anorak and listed all the names of evidence intermediaries used in different disciplines, whether it's environment, health, economics, and how they change in different countries. Canada seems to do things to the US, to Australia, to Europe. So you can't even have this conversation if you've got different labels and names and literatures that don't talk to each other. So I really think we could do a lot more to share the learning and not live in a permanent present. My third point is around thinking big picture about our field as well. And the slide here is from one of the most cited papers on the 3 generations of knowledge mobilization. from Best and Holmes. It's well over a decade old, but it's been adapted, and this was one adaptation of those 3 generations by an old colleague, Anna Hopkins, and others that looked at this question: is our field informed by research, theory, and evidence? And I think the answer is not enough, not really. There's some massive evidence gaps. And that has absolute implications for our practice. We tend to be in this linear first generation, pumping things out the door or focusing on what consultations or things come out. Because I've worked around the ecosystem, I've been getting my hands dirty doing some of those things and despairing about why am I doing something I know that doesn't work. But the system, I think, is still very biased to pumping things out the door. Now, that might work if you're a Geoff Mulgan and you write a blog, or you're an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal or Financial Times. But for most people on the supply side, you're not going to get listened to. And you really need to build not only the second generation of the relational, those good relationships, but also the systemic approach, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. But if the relational is an ideal, at least beyond that failed linear dissemination, and please disagree with me, maybe you think linear is still the way to go. I think Paul Kearney and Catherine Oliver, in their review of the evidence about policy engagement, nailed it by, just the reality is you can't rely on entrepreneurs with lots of energy to go in there and make a difference. We need to think about what Tanya was talking about, the institutionalization. I think she had a great phrase of the taken for grantedness of evidence in policy and practice. We can't just rely on entrepreneurs. But maybe disagree. Maybe you think, all walks of life are about leadership and mavericks and individuals. Maybe that's wrong. But finally, this issue of the systemic, I'm really struggling with this. And I'd love to know your ideas. It sounds good. It's where people want to be, that complex, real world, messy feedback loops. But how do you actually embed evidence into a system? I got a lot of pushback when I was talking about institutionalizing evidence a while back about, it's another new public management audit culture, another imposition from on high, and we'll just game it. It'll be another thing like a regulatory body that will just push back on. And really what you want is a culture, an ethos, an intrinsic motivation for evidence, something you see in professions, some of them. My late father-in-law used to read the British Medical Journal, even when he was retired, because he loved research as a former doctor and psychiatrist. It was part of his DNA. He couldn't imagine not ever really having research. And, I've met policymakers like that. They generally are actually interested and read books and like ideas, are into that conceptual idea of research, not just that dry instrumental use of research. So the system is a challenge, and I'd really love to know your ideas on that. But in summary, that's my 7 minutes. I think there's too much duplication, and I think Will had it right about there's too much of us swimming around, not learning from each other. Maps are a start and not the answer in itself, but there is way too much duplication and needless competition and not learning from other people. We can learn from the past. Does anyone remember the Centers for Evidence-Based Policy in the late 1990s, funded by the ESRC, or the Evidence Network, now long gone, or the Center, was the What Works Center for Children? Try and find me some evidence or something I can use to write this report I've got to do on the evidence ecosystem. I can't find it. And even the people involved are retired or dead. So we do need to learn, and we need to move on by lots of the pointless evaluations I read of the evidence initiatives. And finally, let's learn from other literatures. It might be, Eleanor mentioned cognitive science. It could be from science and technology studies, innovation studies. Let's get creative. We're quite a conservative group. Things don't seem to really change in the last 20 years since I've been involved in this. Can we get more creative and above all, experiment and learn from it? I'll finish there. Thanks, Geoff.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and some great challenges and questions. If anyone on the call feels an urge to answer any of them, please do so in the chat, or I might turn to you if you wish to speak. And I'll also give all our speakers a chance to respond. That last issue about the sort of the shared memory, I think is a really important one. I mentioned it in the paper, where bizarrely lots of spending on evaluations seems to be about the least efficient possible way of organizing a memory you could imagine. And yet it still sort of carries on with its own inertia. I thought it'd been done away with a while ago, but anyway, there's a sort of bizarre inertia which defies the evidence on evidence. So 3 questions from me, and you can each maybe choose which ones you want to address. So first is this issue of almost the ontology, the labels of things, and the systems maps, which both Eleanor and Jonathan mentioned, which are useful and we use in other fields, partly so people can see where they sit in a broader system of evidence, but also to see where the gaps are. I suspect any such map shows some really dense spaces and some which are very empty or unbalanced. What I've never seen in this field is use of social network analysis methods where you actually ask people who is useful to you, who do you get information from, and you get a more objective grounding for those sort of maps. And that might be one sort of future for these systems to become much more sort of systematically self-aware using SNA type methods. Anyway, comments welcome. The second question relates to a couple of things Will said, which is a great interest of mine, which is really how evidence in its sort of narrow definitions fits in to the realities of decision making, which is partly a question of what is synthesis, and synthesis for decisions is quite different from synthesis of evidence. Again, as I say in the paper, in reality, if you're having to make a decision, you look at facts, you look at evidence, you may look at emerging innovations, you have to have some sense of where you want to get to in the future, for which there will not be evidence from the past. So is there actually a mismatch, almost a sort of framing mismatch between the reality of policy making and still how some of the evidence world thinks about it? Because there are actually very few policies you can literally base on evidence. Evidence is an input, but alongside many others. And then thirdly, this question of what the call might be, what the, if you were stuck in a train with Sir Keir Starmer, probably our next Prime Minister, and you had 1 minute to sort of get him to think about this topic, what would you ask? There has been quite a lot of investment in the UK in the last 10 or 20 years, certainly in the hundreds of millions, actually. But what might be the priorities for the next stage? Is it in relation to underlying data infrastructures? Is it about institutions? Is it training? Is it about training the politicians to be better users? What would you prioritize if you really had to make some choices, or should the next government appoint a chief social scientist to pull all of this together? So perhaps we can go around. I'll start with you, Tanya. It's slightly unfair asking you to comment on priorities for the UK, but why not? And we'll see where we get to. So I'll go in order: Tanya, Will, Anna, and Jonathan.
Yeah, and maybe I'm not going to choose the question that was particularly focusing on the UK, but rather the one where you made reference to evidence and whether evidence synthesis and the scope of it is too narrow to then inform policy decision making. And as Will was saying, it's true that in the area of health, we frequently do have more narrow policy questions that are easier answerable by evidence, but not only, right? I mean, wicked questions, of course, are very much part of the health sector landscape as well. And what we do put forward is that, yes, looking at the evidence is important as one of the inputs, as you were saying, Geoff, into decision-making processes, but it will only be one of the forms, and making sure that we have inclusive processes, that we have stakeholder dialogues, that we increasingly, one of the lessons learned also from COVID-19, that citizens, we really have to give them the space so that the tacit knowledge and the lived experience of them is included in decision-making processes. So really complementing the different forms of evidence that are available and making sure, depending on the policy question, and I think that was also, if I remember correctly, one of the questions in the chat, what kind of evidence is important. And one can't really give a one-size-fits-all answer here, because it's so dependent on the policy questions and then also the context to mobilize different kinds of evidence that then feed into the decision-making process. That said, it's also highly important that if we want to really cater for policy priorities and policymakers' needs, that the evidence ecosystem, and now I'm speaking from the supply side, that the different, as we call them, evidence ecosystem work streams, that they more closely work together. And what we mean by evidence ecosystem work streams is, on the one hand, for example, the evidence support infrastructure. That's very much what I talked about, the knowledge brokering organization, but also, again, I'm making reference to the public health sector. If we have a look at health technology assessment guidelines, data analytics, implementation research, all of these different kinds of evidence need to be more closely interoperable. So, for example, when we as WHO go into countries and, for example, work on guidelines, setting up guideline programs, you should also keep in mind the other kind of evidence generation and capacity building, which may be, again, very much aligned, so that we do not create different centers of evidence at country level that don't collaborate, that we create as WHO even more fragmentation or risk of duplication, as Jonathan was saying, but that we try to, from our point of view, when we work with countries, more have a holistic view in supporting countries, having a systems perspective in evidence ecosystem support.
Yeah. Thank you, Tanya. Sorry, we're slightly coming against time.
Yeah.
I want to give everyone a chance to answer, and perhaps even answer some of the things in the chat as well. Some very good questions being put there. Will, over to you. A couple of minutes.
My ask to the presumptive future Prime Minister, if he wants to do one thing and stop paying attention after he's nodded, it would be commission 100 living evidence syntheses to give us proper overview of the evidence and the evidence gaps in policy areas, and to help him be able to cut spending with little political pain later in this Parliament. That's a feasible political ask. My bigger ask, if he wants to do sustained attention, is the phrase you picked up in your paper, Geoff, evidence by default. Every time the government starts a new programme, it should be thinking about how it's going to build in evidence generation and learning from evidence into that programme, policy process, whatever, and that would have a benefit of cutting across the whole evidence ecosystem in a really useful way. Just to pick up the questions in the chat, I think one of the reasons I came to Synthesis from outside of it is I see it as an opportunity to make primary research better and more useful. I think at the moment the publish or perish incentives on academics are brutal and push against actually research being useful. I think when you have good synthesis, that shows you how you can add to a body of knowledge, not just add another bit of knowledge. It can actually make primary research more rewarding and higher impact, and could help research funders create a better set of incentives for primary researchers to be able to do research that they are proud of, both on an academic level and a usefulness level. That's certainly something I hope to see, is more of Synthesis serving good primary research as well as using good primary research.
Thanks. And those points are relevant to several of the comments in the chat about the structure, about the research funders' role, the incentives, and the often slightly rather distorted pressures on researchers and others which don't contribute to what you just described. Eleanor, a couple of thoughts from you.
Yeah, look, I'm particularly tackling that question of, what would the 1 minute pitch be to an incoming Prime Minister, for example. I think that building on the presentation, I'd say that you want investment to be happening at these sort of multiple levels. I think this is a common theme we're all drawing out, is, and in line with the concept of an ecosystem, is you want to simultaneously be working on the supply side about funding better products, demonstrating what good quality looks like, as Will says, the most up-to-date living evidence that's practical and usable. On the demand side, doing some of that capability building, supporting, as you sort of gave a small nod to, how do you support decision makers, including politicians, to be better consumers and demanders of high quality evidence. And then I think there's a lot of glue in the middle that you just can't ignore either, to make sure there is advisory support, that you do have those institutional supports available, so there's an open door, so there's somewhere to go to get good evidence, because that seems to be part of the problem, is not having a central hub for that. But also funding the translation and the networks that are required to keep this whole ecosystem alive is really important. You can see that full picture of what needs to be in place to make this stuff work.
Yeah, and I think it's, as you mentioned in your earlier comments, a lot of this is about individuals who straddle different roles. So your head of the civil service in Australia has an academic background, so understands a lot of this stuff. Wales had a first minister who was, until a week or so ago, who had been a professor of social policy. It's a lot easier if you have individuals who are multilingual. And perhaps one of the problems in the UK government at the moment, there are very few sort of champions in positions of power, either on the political side or the civil service side, which makes this a little bit harder. Jonathan, a final few comments from you and answers to your own questions, maybe.
I really will make it brief though, because there's some great questions in the chat function. But in terms of the mapping, I definitely think we could do a lot more really practical mapping, but also it could be part of research projects. You know, it could be that use of social network analysis or other types of analysis. So, you know, I'd love to see more win-wins that sort of bridge the divides that are genuinely useful, as well as, you know, helping with your REF score as well. On the evidence front, yeah, you're quite right, Geoff, that, you know, a lot of evidence is frankly useless for policy. And this is my plea to my colleagues in universities as well. I've been looking at a lot of briefings, little summary briefings of research for policymakers. And some of them are beautiful, great infographics, but the content's just crap. It should never have been passed. And I'm now being less embarrassed by the fact that my first ever job was a press officer, where we used to have to cull research stories all the time and you just get really diplomatic. I think we need to have that ruthlessness, that a lot of research shouldn't be out there. But maybe we also need, it was one of the questions about more partnerships with policymakers. If research is too slow, can we do rapid cycle testing? Can we do, you know, that horrible phrase of co-production? I don't know, you know, we need to move on from that language, but something that is more timely, and also looking at future stuff. I mean, this isn't new, but, you know, stuff that's about better predictions that aren't just sort of boring AI and analytics, but is, you know, really useful in that here and now decision making.
Yeah. So can I ask you one?
Yeah, go on.
Can I ask you one final question, but also ask anyone on the call to put in the chat an answer to this question too. Several of you have commented on where there might be gaps, where there might be the greatest, as it were, policy need, but the least actual provision of usable evidence. If any of you could sort of say what you think are the best examples of that, where there's a real need for linking the supply and demand, perhaps put it in the chat. I mean, health generally is, we're all jealous because you have loads and loads of evidence and investment in infrastructure and embedding and institutionalization. But where are the opposite examples? And maybe while people think about that and put it in the chat, perhaps, Jonathan, you might answer that question too in our final minute.
Well, I'll just give you one example, and I'm going to piss people off because I know lots of people in the participants, but it's around what can help the policing. I should say this is linked to my research. The police need a particular type of research that is real world, and it's not been provided for various reasons. I'm sure my criminological colleagues would disagree, but the reality is they look at things like prevention, public safety and other things, but not like, how do I deal with that person who's about to beat me up?
Okay, well, maybe if you have thoughts after this session, so I think it's one of the crucial issues for making an evidence ecosystem legitimate, is that it is answering the question, which are the most pressing, most important questions facing our society. And there's not always a perfect alignment of supply and demand. Sadly, we are ahead of time, but thank you all for taking part. Thanks for fantastic contributions, which really were nuanced and serious. And we will, I think, carry on thinking about what might be priorities for the next stage, for a government, for the major funders, and for all of us who in our rather sort of messy ways are part of this fascinating ecosystem, some of which is about eating each other, some of which is swimming past each other, but sometimes is maybe coming together to create something genuinely wonderful.